She was a billionaire CEO. He was a hospital janitor. When she gave him her credit card as a test, she expected him to fail. What he bought instead made her understand something about money and character she'd been blind to her entire life. This is a story about what happens when two worlds collide. Not because of circumstance, but because of character. It's about what we choose when no one's watching, and what that choice reveals about who we really are. It's also a story about invisibility, about the millions of people who work jobs that society depends on but refuses to see, about what it means to be overlooked, undervalued, and invisible in a world that was built on the back of your labor. And it's a story about grace, about what happens when someone finally looks at you and truly sees who you are, not because you've accomplished something extraordinary, but because you're human and you deserve to be seen. Marcus woke up at 11:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 15 minutes before he needed to pick up Emma from daycare. He'd been sleeping for 3 hours, the only sleep he could manage between his night shift at County Medical and the life he actually wanted to live. His daughter was 5 years old, and Marcus had made a decision long ago that he would never let his exhaustion become her problem. The alarm on his phone buzzed. Marcus forced himself out of bed despite every muscle in his body screaming for more rest. His back hurt from mopping floors for 8 hours straight. His hands were raw from the harsh chemicals in the cleaning solutions. His eyes felt like they were full of sand. This was his life now, existing in the narrow space between work and fatherhood, never quite fully present in either world because he was always mentally preparing for the other. He stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. The water was only lukewarm. The building's pipes were old, but it helped wake him up. He looked at himself in the mirror above the bathroom sink. He was 34 years old and looked closer to 45. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. There were deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. 5 years ago, Emma had been born. Marcus had been 29, full of hope, terrified, but ready. Her mother's name was Christine, and they'd talked about being parents together. They'd talked about what their daughter would be like, what they would teach her, what kind of world they would build for her. Christine was beautiful and funny and creative. Marcus loved her completely, but Christine didn't love motherhood. When Emma came home from the hospital, tiny, screaming, needing constant care, something in Christine broke. Or maybe it just revealed that there was a part of her that had never wanted this, had only been going through the motions because it was what you were supposed to do. 2 weeks after Emma was born, Christine looked at Marcus with tears in her eyes and said, "I can't do this. I can't be a mother. I'm not made for this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And then she packed a bag and left. Marcus had stood in the apartment holding his daughter, who was crying, and he'd cried too. He'd cried because his heart was breaking. He'd cried because he was terrified. He'd cried because he had no idea how to take care of a baby, and he was going to have to figure it out. He'd cried because Christine had made a choice to leave, and now he had to make a choice to stay. And staying meant giving up everything else. But he'd made that choice. He'd chosen his daughter over sleep, over money, over ambition, over dating, over having a normal life. He'd chosen to be present. He'd chosen to be the parent who stayed. Now, 5 years later, he dressed quickly in the same clothes he'd worn yesterday and the day before. 3 pairs of jeans rotating through them, washing them when he had time and energy. 5 or 6 shirts, all picked up from thrift stores or given to him by his sister Angela, who understood what it meant to have nothing. 1 pair of work shoes that were held together with duct tape and sheer willpower. 1 pair of regular shoes that he wore when he picked up Emma from daycare, trying to look presentable, trying to be the kind of father that teachers respected, trying to be the kind of man who belonged in spaces where people had more than he did. The apartment was small, 800 square feet in a building that smelled like old cooking and desperation, a mixture of decades of people making do with what they had. The walls were thin. He could hear his neighbors arguing through them at night, could hear the couple upstairs making love or fighting. He could never quite tell which, because they used the same volume and intensity for both. The radiator clanked loudly in winter and provided almost no heat. The air conditioning barely worked in summer. It cooled the room by maybe 5 degrees on good days. The plumbing was temperamental. The landlord was terrible, quick to collect rent, slow to fix anything. But Marcus had negotiated when he signed the lease. He'd shown the landlord his employment letter from the hospital, had explained that he was reliable, had offered to do small maintenance tasks in exchange for a lower rent. $800 a month instead of $950. That $150 a month mattered more than most people would ever understand. That $150 a month was the difference between keeping his head above water and drowning. Emma had a bed with her name painted on the headboard in bright yellow, a project he and Angela had done on a Saturday afternoon when Emma was 3. Angela had held the letter stencils while Marcus painted, and Emma had sat on the floor directing them, telling them the yellow wasn't yellow enough, that it needed to be brighter, that it needed to be the color of sunshine. They'd laughed together, Marcus and Angela, at Emma's serious instructions, at her fierce attention to detail. That yellow headboard was one of the most important things in the apartment. He'd built a bookshelf from reclaimed wood he'd found in an alley behind a construction site, wood that someone else had thrown away, that Marcus had seen and understood, could be transformed into something beautiful and functional. It had taken him 3 weeks to restore it, working late at night after Emma was asleep, sanding it smooth, staining it, treating it with care. Now it held the library books they checked out, the few children's books he'd been able to buy over the years, the stuffed animals Emma couldn't sleep without. Emma's room was decorated with her drawings, her artwork from daycare, her proof that she existed and mattered and had thoughts worth sharing. Marcus had framed some of them, simple dollar store frames, but still. Framing them said, "Your art is valuable. Your thoughts are worth displaying. You matter." That was the only wealth that mattered to Marcus. Everything else, the apartment, the clothes, the shoes held together with duct tape, those were just the machinery that allowed him to be present for her. Those were the sacrifices that bought him access to the thing he actually valued. His time with his daughter, his presence in her life, his fatherhood. Everything else was negotiable. Everything else could be sacrificed. But not that. He grabbed his jacket and headed to the door. It was November, and the city was getting cold. The building hallway smelled like someone was cooking cabbage. He could hear a television through one of the neighbors' walls, a game show, someone winning money they'd never see. He headed down 3 flights of stairs. The elevator had been broken for 2 months, and out into the November air that cut through the city like a knife. The daycare center was in a church basement 6 blocks away. It was affordable because it was run by volunteers, and churches always understood the economics of poverty. They'd been dealing with it for 2,000 years. It was good because the woman who ran it, Ms. Jennifer, genuinely loved children. That love made up for the fact that the facility was in a basement, that the toys were all donated, that the resources were stretched impossibly thin. Marcus walked through the city streets, invisible as always. He passed business people in expensive coats, students with expensive phones, people who belonged to the world in a way that he didn't. They didn't see him. He was the kind of man people looked through, not at. He was invisible in the way that only poor men in service jobs truly understood. He was the infrastructure of their world, the scaffolding that held everything up, but he was never meant to be noticed. He didn't resent it. He'd made peace with invisibility a long time ago. It was actually useful in a way. When you were invisible, people didn't expect anything from you. When you were invisible, you could just do your job and go home. When you were invisible, the only person whose opinion mattered was your daughter. Emma was waiting for him in the doorway of the daycare center, her coat already on, her backpack in her hand. When she saw him, her entire face transformed. The waiting disappeared. The uncertainty vanished. She dropped everything and ran toward him, and he scooped her up and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, which she was. "Daddy," she screamed into his shoulder. "You came back." "I always come back, baby girl," he said, his voice muffled in her hair. Always. She was 5 years old and already understood that coming back wasn't guaranteed, that some people left, that some fathers didn't show up, that she was lucky to have one who did. They walked home together, her hand in his, her chatter filling the space around them. She talked about the boy in her class named Marcus who'd knocked over her block tower. She talked about the song Ms. Jennifer had taught them about seasons. She talked about what she wanted for lunch. She talked about the clouds and whether they tasted like cotton candy. He listened to every word like she was telling him the most important story in the world, because she was. By the time they got home, it was 1 o'clock. Marcus made her lunch, peanut butter and jelly on whole wheat bread, apple slices, a glass of milk. She ate at the small kitchen table while he sat across from her, just watching her chew, watching her think about something, watching her exist. This was his wealth, this moment, this presence. After lunch, he read her a library book about dinosaurs. She had questions about everything. How long did dinosaurs live? Were they scared? Did they have babies? Could we bring them back? He answered each question as best he could, making up explanations when he didn't know the real answer. but doing it in a way that made her think, that encouraged her to wonder. By 3 p.m., she was playing with toys on the floor, and Marcus sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a book he was reading slowly, stretching it out, making it last. He was reading during Emma's nap time and her playtime and every moment he could steal. He read like it was medicine, like it was the only way he could remember that there was a bigger world out there. He fell asleep at 4 p.m., just for a moment, his head tilting back against the wall. He woke at 4:15 when Emma tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, wake up, let's play." He woke immediately, pushing the exhaustion down, becoming present. This was their time. This was what he'd chosen. They played until 5:30 when he started dinner. Rice and beans and frozen vegetables that he'd stretched with a little chicken breast that was on sale at the grocery store. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't nutritious enough, if he was being honest. But it was what he could afford. He cooked it with care anyway, the way his mother had taught him. Like the people eating it mattered. Like the food they consumed was part of a larger love language. Emma ate like it was a feast. She sat at their small kitchen table, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor, and told him everything again. About Marcus and the blocks, about the song, about her thoughts on clouds. He ate slowly, listening, letting her fill the space. By 6:30 p.m. she was tired. Her eyes were getting heavy. Her words were getting slower. He gave her a bath, washing her hair carefully, letting her play with the bubbles. He dried her off and dressed her in pajamas. He read her another book, the same one from this afternoon, because she wanted to hear it again, because repetition was how children learned, because hearing the same story twice meant she trusted that things would repeat, that the world was predictable, that he would be there tomorrow. By 8 p.m., Emma was asleep in her bed. Her breathing was even and deep. Her hand clutched her stuffed rabbit. She looked peaceful in sleep. The weight of the world temporarily lifted from her small shoulders. Marcus sat in the darkness of the apartment and allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. The weight of being one person doing the job of two. The weight of knowing that he made $18 an hour and that Emma's shoes were already getting tight, but he couldn't afford new ones until next month. The weight of understanding that he was doing everything right, and it would still never be enough to give her the life he wanted her to have. But then he thought about this afternoon, about the library, about the look on her face when she solved a word, about the way she said "Daddy" when he picked her up, about the dinosaur questions, about the dinosaur book read twice in one day, and he made peace with it again. This was his life. This was his choice, and he would make it work. He allowed himself 30 minutes of his book. Then he showered and dressed in his work clothes. By 10 p.m., he was on his way to the hospital. By 10:15, he was clocking in. By 10:30, he was mopping floors where people had been born and had died, where families had waited for good news and bad news, where the entire spectrum of human experience had played out. He mopped. He cleaned. He made the world sanitary for the people who would come tomorrow. He was invisible. He was essential. He was utterly alone. Victoria Chen sat in her office on the 42nd floor of the Chen Technologies building and looked at the city below her. The office was minimalist and expensive. White walls, a black desk, a single piece of modern art that cost more than most people made in a year. From this height, people looked like ants. It was fitting, she thought, because people were generally disposable. She was 62 years old. She'd spent 40 years building a company. She'd spent 40 years making money. She'd spent 40 years proving that she was worthy of success. And somewhere in those 40 years, she'd become someone she didn't particularly like. Victoria had built Chen Technologies from nothing. Her parents were immigrants who'd come to the country with 2 suitcases and the kind of hope that comes from desperation. Her mother had worked in textile mills, coming home every night with her hands raw from the machinery, her back curved from leaning over looms all day. Her father had worked in construction, his body broken by physical labor, his spirit slowly crushed by the indifference of men who saw him as expendable. Victoria had watched them work, and she'd made a vow. She would never be dependent on her body. She would be dependent on her mind. She would use her intelligence to build something that would matter, something that would prove she was more than her circumstances. She'd clawed her way through state school while working 2 part-time jobs. She'd started in tech companies that failed spectacularly, learning from each failure what worked and what didn't. She'd taken jobs that paid almost nothing just to learn the industry from the inside. She'd networked obsessively, studied obsessively, invested in herself, taken risks that scared her, made decisions that could have destroyed her, and eventually, All of that had built into something that worked. Chen Technologies now had a market cap of $40 billion. She was worth $2.3 billion personally. The number meant nothing to her anymore. After the first 100 million, money stopped mattering and became just a way to keep score. Just a number on a screen. Just a measurement of how much more she had than everyone else. Her staff was loyal because she paid well. Salaries that other tech companies couldn't match. Her board was compliant because she controlled 51% of the shares, which meant she controlled everything. Her competitors feared her because she was ruthless. She would undercut them, outmaneuver them, crush them if they got in her way. None of that was friendship. All of it was transaction. Victoria had become expert at recognizing when someone was calculating their angle against her, measuring how much honesty they could sacrifice before it actually cost them something. Everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted something. She'd learned this the hard way. She'd been betrayed by her first husband, who married her for access to her growing network and then cheated on her with her business partner's wife. He'd thought she wouldn't find out. He'd thought he could compartmentalize. But Victoria found out. Because Victoria found out everything. She had him followed. She had their phones monitored. She gathered evidence the way she gathered data, methodically, relentlessly, completely. She'd been betrayed by that business partner, who stole intellectual property and sold it to a competitor for a quick $10 million. He'd thought he could hide it. He'd thought the contract he signed had loopholes. But Victoria's lawyers were better. She sued him. She won. She took everything. She'd been betrayed by her best friend of 20 years, who'd taken a job at a rival company and tried to recruit her entire engineering team. Victoria had seen the emails. She'd confronted her about it. Her best friend had cried and apologized and said it was a mistake. Victoria had nodded and accepted the apology, and then made sure her best friend was unhireable in the industry forever. But the worst betrayal came from her own daughter. Her daughter's name was Sophie. Victoria had had her when she was 35, during a brief marriage to a man she'd thought she loved, but who'd ultimately just wanted to be married to her success. Sophie grew up with nannies, with private schools, with money, but without her mother. Victoria was always working, always building, always focused on the next thing, the next challenge, the next victory. Sophie had learned early that her mother's time was the most valuable commodity in the world, and that Sophie didn't have access to it. Sophie had learned to stop asking for her mother's attention. Sophie had learned to stop trying. When Sophie was 16, she told Victoria she wanted to be an artist. Victoria had paid for the best art schools. Sophie had gone to Princeton instead, studying business, trying to understand the world her mother inhabited. But Victoria had barely noticed because she was in the middle of a hostile takeover of a rival company. When Sophie was 20, she got engaged. Victoria had attended the wedding. She'd bought an expensive dress. She'd given an expensive gift. But she hadn't been present. She'd taken calls during the reception. She'd checked emails during the ceremony. She'd left before the dancing started because she had a board meeting the next morning. When Sophie was 25, she'd had a baby, Victoria's only grandchild. Victoria had sent gifts. She'd visited once. She'd held her granddaughter for 15 minutes before her assistant called to remind her about a conference call. When Sophie was 30, she'd talked to a journalist. She'd talked about what it was like to have a mother who was never there. She'd talked about missing her mother even though her mother was alive. She talked about how her mother chose money over family, over her, over everything that actually mattered. The article had run in a major magazine. Victoria had read it on a plane where she couldn't escape it, where she couldn't pretend it wasn't happening, and she'd realized, in that moment, that her daughter was right. After that, Victoria and Sophie had coffee twice a year out of obligation. Sophie was polite. She answered questions, but there was no warmth there. There was no relationship. Just the empty husk of one. So Victoria had learned to trust only numbers. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't betray you. Numbers were honest in their complete indifference to your feelings. Numbers were pure. Numbers were safe. She'd become a woman who measured everything in ROI, return on investment. She invested in businesses that paid dividends. She invested in people who would pay her back in loyalty or fear. She invested in a life that was built on the principle that everyone wanted something. So the best strategy was to always know what they wanted and control the mechanism by which they got it. Knowledge was power. Leverage was protection. And if you understood that everyone had a price, then you could never be truly surprised or disappointed by anyone's behavior. Her office on the 42nd floor was like a fortress. It had a view of the entire city. It had everything she could want. But it was also the loneliest place on earth. She had a doctor's appointment that afternoon, a routine checkup, though nothing about her life was routine. County Medical was where she went, despite being able to afford the best private doctors in the city, despite being able to fly to Switzerland to see specialists whose names only other billionaires knew. She'd always believed in testing systems. Why pay more when you could see how the regular system actually worked? It was a way of staying grounded, seeing reality instead of a curated version of it, though grounded was perhaps the wrong word. What she really meant was a way of reminding herself that even in regular hospitals, people knew who she was. People treated her differently. People wanted something from her. She didn't expect anything to change on that Tuesday afternoon. She didn't expect to meet anyone who would question her entire philosophy about human nature. She didn't expect to be proven wrong. Marcus was cleaning the third-floor waiting room when he heard the commotion. A woman in an expensive coat had arrived, and suddenly the energy in the hospital changed. The receptionist stood up straighter. The nurses moved faster. The administrators appeared like they'd been summoned. The staff started moving with purpose, speaking differently, trying to impress her with their competence and their professionalism. Marcus didn't look up from his work. He'd learned a long time ago not to notice when important people came through. People like that were always coming through hospitals. Politicians, executives, wealthy benefactors who donated enough money to get wings named after them. They didn't see the people cleaning up after them. They were too busy being impressive to notice the invisible. He continued mopping the same floor for 45 minutes, moving around the waiting room carefully, making sure he didn't disturb anyone. He was good at making himself small. He'd had a lot of practice, years of practice, a lifetime of practice. Victoria checked in at the desk. She was impatient as usual. She had a meeting at 4 p.m. and another at 6 p.m. and she hated waiting. She hated the inefficiency of the public healthcare system, hated the way the receptionist took 7 minutes to get her checked in, hated that she had to sit in a waiting room with regular people who coughed without covering their mouths, who brought their sick children, who represented everything about the world that was messy and uncontrolled. She placed her Hermes bag on the counter, casually, the way people do when they're not thinking about what things cost because cost has never been real to them. The bag cost $4,000. She'd bought it without thinking about it, the same way someone else might buy a coffee. It was just a bag to her, just a place to put her things. The fact that it cost more than most people made in a month was irrelevant to her thinking process. Victoria took a seat in the waiting room and pulled out her phone. She had emails to answer. She had texts from her assistant about conference calls. She had the entire world's problems demanding her attention. She didn't notice the man mopping the floor. He was invisible to her just like he was invisible to everyone else. She didn't notice when she left her card there. It had slipped out of her wallet when she pulled out her phone, fallen onto the floor beside the waiting room chair, rolled slightly under the edge where the cleaning person would find it when he emptied the trash. She didn't realize it was gone until hours later. Marcus found it while emptying the trash can beside the check-in desk. He pulled it out, looked at it. Victoria Chen, Visa Infinite, $89,000 credit limit. The plastic was heavy, premium, the kind of credit card that only a certain kind of person carried. He stared at it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. $89,000. That was more money than he made in 5 years. That was enough to change his life. For just a moment, just a fraction of a second, he imagined what he could do with it. He could pay off his debts. He could move to a better apartment. He could send Emma to private school. He could breathe. Then he turned it over to the receptionist without hesitation, without letting himself imagine further. "Found this," he said simply. "Belongs to the woman who was here earlier." The receptionist took it, thanked him, and that was that. Marcus went back to mopping. He didn't expect anything else to happen. This was his job. This was what he did. He found things and he returned them. He cleaned up after people and he remained invisible. This was the way of the world. This was how things worked. By the time Victoria realized her card was missing, it had already been returned to her. She got a call before she could even worry about it or call her assistant to cancel it. The receptionist explained what had happened. Victoria felt a moment of something, curiosity maybe, or surprise. In her experience, when people found valuable things, they either took them or they waited to see if there was a reward. They calculated. They thought about what they could do with it. They tested the boundaries. But this man had just returned it. No questions asked. No reward expected. No angle calculated. Victoria was intrigued. That should have been the end of the story. Cards are found and returned every day. The world works like it's supposed to occasionally and then keeps spinning. But Victoria Chen was not someone who accepted coincidence. And something about how a stranger had handled her card, without hesitation, without calculation, without waiting to see if there was a reward, stuck with her. It bothered her. It challenged her assumptions. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, her theory about human nature was wrong. Victoria made a phone call that evening. She asked the hospital administrator to identify the man who'd found her card. She wanted to thank him, she said. What she was actually doing was testing a hypothesis. The hospital manager found Marcus at 5 p.m. on Thursday. Marcus was on his break, sitting in the break room with a thermos of coffee that he'd made at home that morning, and a paperback book he'd checked out from the library. He was reading slowly, deliberately, stretching it out because the library books were free and he could only check out 3 at a time. Marcus was surprised to be called into an office. His first thought was that he'd done something wrong. That was always his first thought, that something was his fault, that he'd somehow failed at the invisible job of existing as a poor person in a space designed for people with money. But the manager smiled. "Ms. Chen wants to thank you for returning her card. She'd like to take you to dinner." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Dinner? With a woman like that? He didn't know what to say. His first thought was to refuse. He didn't have time for dinners. He had Emma. He had sleep he needed to catch up on. He had floors to mop the next night. He had a life that was structured around the exact opposite of spontaneous meals with rich strangers. He had no clean clothes that looked like dinner clothes. He had no experience in restaurants like the ones a woman like Victoria Chen would go to. But something in him, maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was loneliness, maybe it was just the desire to be noticed for once in his life, to be seen as something other than the invisible man who cleaned the floors, made him accept. "Yes," he heard himself say, "I'd like that." He called Angela. She could watch Emma. She always could. Angela didn't ask questions. She just said yes. That's what family did. They showed up. Marcus went home and showered and put on the only nice pants he owned, khakis that were a little worn at the cuffs but clean. He ironed them carefully, using a board that was really just an old towel on the bed. He put on a button-down shirt that he usually wore to Emma's school events, the only dress shirt he owned. He looked in the mirror and saw himself the way he always saw himself, a tired man trying his best. He didn't look rich. He didn't look impressive. He looked like what he was, a single dad who worked nights and cleaned hospitals and was doing his best to raise a daughter on $18 an hour. But he went anyway. They met at a restaurant called Meridian. It was the kind of place where the waiters knew who you were before you sat down, the kind of place where your name was already in their reservation system, the kind of place where people like Marcus only went if they were with people like Victoria. Victoria was already seated when he arrived. She stood to greet him, which surprised him. He wasn't used to people of her status standing for him. She was taller than he expected and thinner, and when she shook his hand, her grip was firm. She looked at him directly, which was something most people didn't do. Most people looked at poor men like they were furniture, present but not worth really seeing. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wanted to understand something about you. You found something valuable. You didn't keep it. You didn't even wait to see if there was a reward. Why?" Marcus didn't know what to say. The question felt larger than it should have been. He'd simply returned the card because that's what you did. You returned things that weren't yours. You didn't think about it. You just did it. It wasn't brave. It wasn't remarkable. It was just the only choice that made sense. "It wasn't mine," he said finally. Seemed simple. Victoria studied him. She recognized immediately that he wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't calculating what angle would make him look better in her eyes. He was just honest. It was so foreign to her that it was almost disturbing. They ordered. Marcus was terrified of the menu. The prices weren't listed. He ordered salmon because it sounded simple. Victoria ordered something with a name he couldn't pronounce. As they ate, Victoria asked him real questions. She asked about Emma, about what it was like to work nights, about how he'd become a single father, about what he dreamed of, about what scared him. And Marcus, who almost never talked about himself, found himself talking. He told her about Emma's first word. He told her about the night her mother left. He told her about the fear that lived in his chest every day. Victoria listened in a way that very few people ever had. She listened like his words mattered, like his struggles were worth understanding, like he was worth understanding. By the end of dinner, Victoria had made a decision. "I want to test something with you," she said. "You have character. Real character. I want to understand what that looks like when someone has unlimited resources. If you had unlimited resources for 24 hours, what would you buy?" She pulled out her credit card and set it on the table. "Use it for a day. Buy whatever you need, whatever you want. Then tell me what you learned." Marcus wanted to say no, but something in Victoria's face suggested she genuinely wanted to understand something, so he accepted. Marcus spent the first few hours of the next morning just thinking. He lay in bed after Emma had left for daycare, staring at the ceiling, holding the credit card, feeling its weight. He could buy new clothes, he could buy a better apartment, he could buy rest, he could buy time, things his body was screaming for. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something. Victoria's test wasn't about his wants. It was about what he wouldn't abandon even when he could have anything. By mid-morning, he knew what he had to do. He went to the bookstore first, not for himself. He bought Emma 6 new books, the ones she'd asked about but he couldn't afford, $180. Then he went to the grocery store. He filled his cart with things they never had: fresh fruit, good cheese, real butter, salmon, almonds, honey, olive oil, $340. His sister's birthday was in a week. He bought her a massage gift certificate, $200. She'd never had a massage. She deserved to feel taken care of. For his mother, who'd sacrificed everything to help him, he booked a night at a hotel, $280. She deserved rest. He got his teeth cleaned, $150. He deserved care too. Then he went to the toy store. He bought real toys for Emma, wooden puzzles, art supplies, construction sets, things that would last, $420. He imagined her face when she opened them. By the end of the day, he'd spent $2,890. He didn't buy anything for himself. Victoria sat across from Marcus in her office. She'd asked him to come back. Marcus brought the receipts in a folder. He'd organized them carefully: books, groceries, gifts, dental work, toys. "I didn't spend it on me," he said. "I realized that if I spent it on myself, it wouldn't change who I am. But if I spent it on other people, it could change their lives. Not permanently, but for a moment I could give them the gift of feeling taken care of. And that seemed more important than anything I could buy for myself." Victoria felt something shift in her chest. She felt tears coming. She forced them back down. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "Everyone I know uses money to insulate themselves, to prove they're better. I'm the same way. And the more money I made, the more isolated I became, because no one was willing to be honest with me anymore. And then I met you, and I expected you to prove my theory, that everyone has a price. But you didn't. You proved the opposite." She slid a folder across the desk. "I'm starting a scholarship program for children of single parents working multiple jobs. I want you to run it. It pays $150,000 a year. You'll work 4 days a week. You'll have time to be Emma's father." Marcus's hands trembled. "Why?" he asked. "Because you showed me something," Victoria said. "You showed me that character doesn't require witnesses. Grace doesn't require gratitude. You do good because it's good. That's rare, and I spent $1 billion never finding that." 3 months later, Marcus selected his first scholarship cohort, 12 children of single parents. He interviewed each one. He selected kids who'd been caught being kind when no one was watching, kids who understood that their actions mattered. While Marcus built his foundation, Victoria changed her life. She stepped back from her company. She had lunch with her daughter for the first time in 7 years. It took time, real time, but over months, something shifted. Emma started her scholarship the next year. She got tutoring. She got mentorship. She got art classes. She got music lessons. She got the message over and over that her potential mattered. She grew up knowing that her father was someone who mattered, someone respected, someone whose integrity was recognized. Years later, when people asked Victoria what changed her life, she always said the same thing: "I gave someone a credit card to test them and they used it to show me who I really was." Marcus didn't prove that character matters. He showed me that I'd forgotten what character even looked like. He showed me that I'd spent so long building a life around money that I'd forgotten money was just a tool. And when they asked Marcus how his life had changed, he said something simpler. Someone finally looked at me and saw who I was. Not what I had, not how much I was struggling, just who I was. That's the rarest wealth in the world, being truly seen. The scholarship program grew. By year 5, It helped 200 children. By year 10, it had a $3 million endowment. Victoria eventually gave up her CEO role completely. The program became her primary focus. She worked with other wealthy people, convincing them to invest in the futures of children like Emma. But more than that, she changed how the scholarship operated. It wasn't just about giving money. It was about changing how society saw invisible work. The program highlighted the parents, the single mothers and fathers working multiple jobs, the custodians, the healthcare workers. It celebrated them. It made them visible. Marcus became an advocate. He started speaking, not in a polished way, but in an authentic way that made people listen. He talked about what it meant to be invisible. He talked about the cost of invisibility. He talked about what it felt like to suddenly be seen. And his story became a story that changed things. Slowly, the way real change happens. People started to notice the workers cleaning their hospitals. People started to think about the single parents working multiple jobs. People started to understand that these people weren't failures of the system. They were heroes of the system. Years after that Tuesday in November, after the credit card was found and returned, after Victoria gave her card away for a day, after Marcus showed her what character actually looked like, something fundamental had shifted in the world. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It wasn't visible in the headlines, but it was real. Single parents started to be celebrated instead of judged. Invisible workers started to be recognized. The scholarship program grew into a movement. Other wealthy people caught the vision. Other businesses started to pay better. Other people started to see the invisible. And Victoria and Marcus remained friends. Not wealthy person and poor person friends, but real friends. They had coffee together. They talked about what mattered. They built something beautiful together. Victoria's daughter slowly came back into her life. She didn't forgive immediately, but she forgave eventually. And they rebuilt their relationship, not from the ashes, but on a foundation of honesty and time and presence. And Emma grew up to be a teacher. She taught chemistry at a public high school, trying to make science exciting for kids who'd grown up in poverty, trying to show them that they could understand the world and change it. Marcus watched her graduate from college. He cried, not because she'd succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but because she'd never had to wonder if she was enough. She'd always known, from the time Victoria first invested in her, that she was valuable, that her potential mattered. Here's what no one expected. Here's what changed everything. Victoria wasn't testing Marcus. Marcus was testing Victoria. No, that's not quite right either. What actually happened is this. They were both testing themselves. Victoria gave Marcus the card because she needed to know if her theory about human nature was right, if everyone really did have a price, if character was just a luxury that poor people could afford. Marcus accepted the card because he needed to know if his own character was real, if it would hold up when he had unlimited resources, if it was genuine or just a survival mechanism. And what they discovered, together, was that character isn't a choice. It's not something you decide to have when circumstances permit. Character is who you are. It's the fundamental orientation of your soul. Marcus spent the money the way he did because that's who he is. He's the kind of man who loves his daughter more than he loves himself. He's the kind of man who thinks about other people first. He's the kind of man who understands that real wealth is connection, not accumulation. Victoria recognized this not because she was wise or good, but because underneath all the money and all the protection and all the walls she'd built, she still remembered what goodness looked like. She still had the capacity to see it when it walked into her office. And that recognition, that ability to see character in another person, changed her. This story is a reminder that the most magnetic people aren't those who take opportunities. They're those who recognize what matters and protect it, even when no one's watching. They're those who understand that character is the only currency that compounds in how people see you, how they remember you, how they become better versions of themselves because they knew you. Marcus bought books and food and gave gifts. Victoria gave her money, her time, her understanding, her willingness to be transformed by meeting someone different from herself. And between them, they built something that neither could have built alone, a path for invisible children to become the most visible versions of themselves. In a world that taught both of them to be invisible, Marcus through poverty, Victoria through wealth, they became visible to each other. And that visibility changed everything. The credit card had $89,000 on it. Marcus spent $2,890 and returned it. He spent less than 3% of what was available, But in those 3%, he revealed everything about who he actually is. And Victoria, who'd spent her entire life accumulating money and power and influence, realized in one afternoon that none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was connection. The only thing that mattered was being seen. The only thing that mattered was seeing others. This is the story of how Grace found both of them, not because they deserved it, but because they were willing to be honest. They were willing to be vulnerable. They were willing to see each other, and in that seeing, they were transformed.